I'd like to open up your Bible this morning to Mark chapter 2. We're taking on another large section, going all the way to chapter 3, verse 6. Following one main theme that's moving through this entire section, a section that ends with the Pharisees plotting the death of Jesus Christ. Starting in verse 13. He went out again beside the sea, and all the crowd was coming to him, and he was teaching them. And he passed by, and he saw Levi, the son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax booth. And he said to him, "Follow me." And he arose and he followed him. And as he reclined at his table in the house, many tax collectors and sinners were reclining with Jesus and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. And the scribes of the Pharisees, when they saw that he was eating dinner with sinners and tax collectors, said to his disciples, "Why? Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners?" And Jesus heard it, and he said to them, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I came not to call the righteous, but sinners." Now John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting, and people came and said to him, "Why? Why do John's disciples and the Pharisees fast, but your disciples don't fast?" And Jesus said to them, "Can the wedding guest, while the bridegroom is still with them, fast? Oh, as long as they have the bridegroom with them, they cannot fast. The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast on that day. No one sews a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment. If he does, the patch tears away from it, the new from the old, and a worse tear is made. And no one puts new wine in old wineskins. If he does, the wine will burst the skins, and the wine is destroyed, so are the skins. But new wine is for fresh wineskins." One Sabbath he was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. And the Pharisees were saying to him, Look, why? Why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he was in need and he was hungry, and those who were with him? How he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar the high priest, and he ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat, and also gave it to those who were with him?" And he said to them, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." And the final, chapter 3, again he entered the synagogue, and a man was there with a withered hand, and they watched to see whether Jesus would heal him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. And he said to the man with the withered hand, "Come here." And he said to them, "Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save a life or to kill?" But they were silent. And he looked around them with anger, and he grieved at the hardness of their hearts. And he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out immediately and held counsel with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. What do we see moving across all these accounts? We see the Pharisees. They're in every vignette that we see. And before we go into the text, I want to kind of try to connect this to help us understand how do we go about looking at this text today, because there are countless people who live their entire life believing that God is most pleased with the people who live by the most rules. There's people who live by the standard that God is most pleased by the people who follow the most rules. Those who pursue the highest standards of morality and the greatest degree of personal separation from the world around us. And these people are often those who judge those around them by their own personal standard of righteousness. But what we see in the text this morning is quite the opposite. What does Jesus do in every single account? Jesus is exposing the wholesale inadequacies of all of these customs that had become part of the Jewish faith by the first century. all of the legalism that was added on, all of the extra rule keeping that was added on. And in this, Jesus never condemns the Mosaic covenant. The Mosaic covenant is good. It is grace. It is given by God. But what Jesus is doing is he's confronting a group of people who have reduced their worship of God and their pursuit of God to a burdensome list of man-made rules. It's an exhaustive list of do's and don'ts. It's like living by an itemized religious checklist, just checking boxes, making sure that I'm doing everything I'm supposed to be doing to be the person. It's a religious report card that enables us to compare ourselves to everybody else around us. Look at my religious achievements. Look at what I'm doing. Look at what I'm not doing. In very much the same way that anybody who plays computer games can compare their character stats and their upgrades and their achievements with each other. But that's not biblical Christianity. And this is why Jesus is so utterly scandalous to the religious leaders of his day. Jesus doesn't fit the religious mold. In fact, I think the main idea going throughout this entire section today is this: Jesus came to save sinners, not to congratulate self-righteous rule keepers. Jesus came to save sinners, not congratulate self-righteous rule keepers. And we see this clearly manifest three ways in these four encounters. I'm going to be taking the final two on the Sabbath and combining them. But we see these three movements. One, Jesus didn't come to condemn religious outsiders. We see that in verses 13 through 17. In verses 18 through 22, we see that Jesus didn't come merely to promote religious piety. Question on fasting. And number four, both accounts on the Sabbath. Jesus didn't come to endorse religious tradition. So those are the three main headers, but we're going to address those later in the message. Normally I would use those three walking through, but in an effort to approach or take on all this text in one morning, I'm going to break it up into three different sections: the saints, the sinners, and the scandal. And we'll come back to these main points at the end. And actually, in your notes, put quotation marks around the saints and the sinners. Because the saints, according to the Pharisees, are themselves, right? And for the most part, we got to remember that in the first century world, Pharisees were some of the most highly esteemed people in the Jewish community. When they heard Pharisee, they didn't hear hypocrite like we hear, right? We hear Pharisee, we hear hypocrite. That's not what they heard in their mind. That they looked at Pharisee and they said, if there's anybody that God is pleased with, it's the Pharisee. Because they did everything in their power to live a life that glorified God. That's how people saw them. See, from the very beginning, we got to realize that the Pharisees were a religious reform movement. And the church always has little reform movements, not only the Great Reformation, but there's always reform movements of people looking at the current conditions and trying to call us back to faithfulness. And they were a reform movement, and that was rightly devoted to holiness and avoiding anything that might defile them. They looked at the history of Israel. They saw the reason they got kicked out of the land, and they're like, we don't want to do that again. We want to do everything we can not to mess this thing up. So to accomplish this end, here's what they did. They erected what we might call a fence or a buffer zone around the Mosaic law. Okay? So they kind of went way out from what the law said. They went way out and they established this extra buffer zone. It's kind of like a warning track on a baseball field. You know, you hit the warning track, the wall's coming, right? It's like the rumble strips down the side of the highway. So, you're going to the middle, you hit the rumble strip, you go to the side, you hit the rumble strip, and it says, you don't really want to keep going this way. That's what they did. So they established all these extra traditions to protect themselves from actually failing at a point of the law. And as you read through the Gospels, the thing that we see is that Jesus never attacks their pursuit of obedience to God. He condemns them for their cold-hearted, inconsistent hypocrisy. Not from where they started, but for what they've become. Because what they did is they ended up elevating that buffer zone. They ended up elevating that warning track to the same level as Mosaic law. So no longer was it a buffer zone and a warning to protect us from actually getting hurt by sinning against God in the law. It now became law in and of itself, and it became sin. So the warning track now is out of bounds. Just imagine, paint a white line around your outfield at the warning track. Field of play stops here. You're driving down the road and you drift and hit the rumble strip. You get pulled over and you get given a ticket. No longer there is a protection against an infraction, but it becomes an infraction in and of itself. And by Jesus' day, every aspect of religious life had been neatly categorized into holy, inflexible, black and white categories, which meant that there were basically two classes of people. Those who were in and those who were out. Those who were saints and those who were sinners. See, so when Jesus calls Levi to follow him in verse 14, Jesus is calling one of the worst sinners he could possibly call to be one of his inner group. I mean, he's calling the ultimate religious outsider. See, because first, history tells us that people named Levi in the first century were, most of these people, they were Levites. It's kind of like their nickname, right? Levi. This guy is most likely, okay, we're not going to bank everything on it. He may not be, but it's very likely this guy's a Levite. And if he's a Levite, just now think what he's done. He's abandoned his religious post, serving God in the temple, and he's become a traitor to serve the Roman government to collect their taxes. I mean, he's completely turned his back on his people. Second, tax collectors were utterly despised, and not just because they'd collect taxes, right? I mean, it's hard to be a Christian IRS agent, I guess, you know? I know there are some, but this is far worse, okay? Because this is what happened, and this is what doesn't happen with ours, thankfully, is that you became a tax collector, and how you made your money was by charging on top of. So if you had to collect $10 from one guy for whatever he's doing, you would charge him as much as you could on top of that. So the whole thing about being a tax collector is that you are a professional extortionist. That's what you do for a living. You live to rip off people to line your pockets. So in other words, tax collecting by its very nature was manipulative, corrupt, and oppressive. In fact, the Jewish hatred of tax collectors goes so far that the Jewish rabbis made rules about interactions with tax collectors. If a tax collector entered your house became ceremonially unclean. Okay, we talked about uncleanliness back with the guy with leprosy, remember? So now this is what they just prescribed. If a tax collector enters your house, you might as well invite a leper into your house. You might as well put a dead body in your house. That's the same thing as having a tax collector come visit you. That's how despised they were. Second, the poor were forbidden to receive alms from a tax collector, despite their neediness, because tax collectors lived by extortion and legalized robbery. Third, rabbis even proclaimed that you could lie to a tax collector in order to protect your property. They proclaimed that you could break one of the 10 in order to protect your property from a tax collector. See, Jesus' interactions with Levi, they're utterly scandalous. And not only does he call him in, but he goes and he has dinner with him. And in our culture today, we don't really think it's much. I mean, we can have dinner or lunch with anybody, right? We can have lunch with a coworker we really don't even care about, but we're going to have lunch anyway. But see, that's not how it worked in the culture here. To have dinner together with somebody was an expression of intimate friendship and acceptance. That's what it communicates. So when Jesus is reclining with tax collectors and sinners, that's what it's communicating. Meals affirmed your social status by clearly displaying which crowd you belong to. Are you part of the in crowd or are you part of the out crowd? You know, it's like the high school lunchroom. Yeah, I was at the other crowd's table. And by using the term sinners here, Mark is telling us that Levi's friends, these men and women that are at this party, are people who rightly deserve scorn and shame for their openly sinful lifestyles. They're unscrupulous, they're ceremonially unclean. Jesus is hanging out with the scum of the earth. That's how the Pharisees are looking at Jesus' interaction with these people. But you see the contrast in the text? Jesus reclines at dinner with Levi and his friends. What are the Pharisees doing? They're standing on the perimeter in judgment. They're kind of standing back, they're holding their nose. They're not engaged, they're looking on and they're judging. Even more, what do we see in the text? That in verse 14, Levi follows Jesus. We see tax collectors and sinners in verse 15 follow Jesus. What are the Pharisees not doing? They're not following Jesus. No, rather they judge and reject Jesus as a sinner. See, the scandal in these four accounts is that the religious insiders are realizing that Jesus is playing by a completely different set of rules. They've been playing a religious game their entire life. They've given their life to learning every single rule. And Jesus walks in and burns the rule book. So what's the scandal? I want to point out three things in this text. We could go deep into them, but I want to hit the highlights because I think there's some applicational things that we could miss as we get tied into cultural backgrounds and some other things. So there's some important things I want us to see. Number one, is that in the account of Levi and his friends, we see this, is that Jesus didn't come to condemn religious outcasts. He didn't come to condemn them. See, the scandal here is that Jesus didn't demand that tax collectors and sinners and prostitutes had to clean up their lives before he would spend time with them. He didn't say, I'll come to your house if you straighten some things out in your life first. He didn't say that. To put it another way, a relationship with Jesus is not like going for a ride on Space Mountain at Disneyland. You know, they have those height charts, right? And if you want to go on the ride, you got to be tall enough. And when we went to Disneyland, when my girls were little, the biggest concern we had is that they wouldn't be able to ride the fun rides because my kids are short. I mean, I think we got them like tall flip-flops, give them a little bit extra boost, you know. It's like, got to make the line. We didn't come all the way down here to ride the teacups, right? But what's going on is the Pharisees have set this high bar for any interaction, any relationship. See, Jesus doesn't set a high bar and call you to meet it before he will interact with you. But dead-hearted, legalistic religion does. Constantly sets high bars. Constantly sets barriers that people cannot overcome, but people need to get past if they're going to interact with a Christian and have a relationship with somebody who can share the gospel with them. See, Jesus doesn't set a high bar. He doesn't set the bar because nobody can make the bar. Romans 3:23, right? For all have sinned, all have fallen short of the glory of God. Everybody. Yeah, some people are better sinners than others, right? But the problem is still there. And what we see in this text is that Jesus does so much more than preach repentance at sinners. Jesus doesn't go to the party to stand on a soapbox in a corner and preach a hellfire brimstone sermon at all the people who need to hear it. He enters their world, he reclines at the table, and he enters their lives. He invades their space. I mean, that's what's going on. He's invading their space with compassion and gospel purpose because they're not subhuman pieces of trash. They're men and women created in the image of God. Just like the people in your life. Not subhuman pieces of trash. Human beings created in the very image of God. And the mere fact that Jesus accepts this invitation to Levi's house helps us see the difference in his mission and the mission of the Pharisees. The Pharisees are coming to distinguish, they're coming to enlighten, they're coming to judge, but Jesus comes to befriend and redeem. That's why Jesus came. Listen to Mark chapter 2, 16 through 17. The scribes of the Pharisees, when they saw that he was eating with the sinners and the tax collectors, said to his disciples, "Why does he eat? Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners? Why does he eat with the scum of the earth?" And when Jesus heard them, he said to them, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. And I came not to call the righteous, but sinners." See, he's saying you don't understand. I came to help sinners just like a doctor comes to heal the sick. How many of you think that a doctor works with the ill because he wants to get infected? Is that just ludicrous? People don't go to med school so they can do everything it takes so they can get into a room with a bunch of sick people so they can get sick. Jesus is saying it's ludicrous what you're thinking of why I'm here. I'm not here just to party. I'm not here to participate in their sin. Everyone knows. Doctors spend time with the ill so they can help them get healed. See, the kingdom of God is not contaminated by contact with sinners. It's not contaminated by contact with unbelievers. So Jesus is showing us. He's not contaminated. Jesus came to bring restoration. He came to bring healing. He came to bring reconciliation to God. Not to say that we don't ever identify sin, but I think so many times as Christians, we're so quick and eager to condemn sin, we forget that condemning sinners in their sin is like, in many ways, condemning a disabled person for their disability, a barren couple for their infertility, a cancer patient for their cancer, or a deceased person for their deadness. Ephesians chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. Doesn't mean we can't talk about legality, doesn't mean that we can't talk about standards, no. But we need to understand that the interaction, what's at the ground level, there's a spiritual state that needs to change. Where often what we're focused on is simply the external behavior, not the heart. And that's what's so deadly about Phariseeism. See, sinners don't need open hostility. What do they need? They need divine healing. They need spiritual life. They need eyes that can see, ears that can hear, a heart that can understand. And piety and religious traditions won't get them there. Only faith in Christ will get them there. See, the next two interactions, which we're spending much less time on, deal with those two factors. The account of the fasting. We got John the Baptist's disciples, and we got the Pharisees. And what we see in this account is that Jesus didn't come to promote religious piety. Now, Jesus isn't against religious piety. He goes out into the wilderness and prays. Jesus fasts. But what's the question? Verse 18, chapter 2. Now John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting, and people came to him and said, "Why do John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees fast, but your disciples, they don't fast?" Now, on one hand, fasting was a very important display of religious piety in first century Judaism. And it could denote a couple of things. It could denote sorrow, grief, repentance, or devotion to God. All of those things. But by the time of Jesus, by the time we get to the first century, Israel had added 5 yearly fasts to their calendar. But on top of that, the Pharisees took up the practice of fasting on every Monday and every Thursday, twice a week, to demonstrate their devotion to God. And I'm not saying that began with a bad heart. But it appears to be that by the time of Jesus, it's simply become religious observance, fleshly pursuits of religious standards. And so when this question comes up to Jesus, what this pointed question is, it's an indictment. It's an indictment against their piety. In essence, they're asking, how in the world can you claim to be a messenger from God when your life doesn't even come close It doesn't even come close to the religious devotion that we see in John's disciples and we see in the Pharisees. How can you even claim that, Jesus? If you want us to take you seriously, you better start towing the line. You better start making the grade. Because unless you start doing this, we're not going to pay attention to you. That's the question about fasting. But what do we see in Jesus' response? Is Jesus against fasting? No. No, he's not. He's not against expressions of religious piety. He's not. What does he say? My disciples are going to have every reason to fast in the future. But now's a specific time in life where they're not fasting, and they're not fasting for a reason. Picture it this way. It's like a wedding. Who goes to a wedding and looks at all of the food that's spread out and intentionally fasts at a wedding? We don't do that. Okay, if you're watching your weight, you're trying to be careful, you're looking for the broccoli, you're not dipping it in ranch. But right, you're still eating. It's like they're not doing it because there's something different going on. When it comes to fasting, it's all about timing. And in Jesus' reply, Jesus is saying, if you really understood who I was, you wouldn't be fasting either. But the fact that you're asking this question reveals the truth that you really don't understand who I am. If you understood, you'd be celebrating. You wouldn't be judging. And the problem is they're trying to understand Jesus in light of the past. That's the whole picture of the cloth being sewn on and the whole picture of the wineskins. Okay, new cloth on old cloth, you put it through the wash, it tears away. You put new wine in old wineskins as it ferments and bubbles and everything, it's going to blow out that old wineskin because it's already stretched. Okay, that's the essence of the two pictures. See, they're looking at Jesus possibly like in the lens of the prophets of old. When they came, what did they do? They were always calling Israel back to faithfulness to the old covenant. They were calling them back to covenant renewal and submission to the Torah. And Jesus' ministry doesn't look like that. And that's why they're struggling. It doesn't look like everything that they've experienced or they could read in their Old Testament. And it's because Jesus didn't come to patch up the old covenant. That's what he's telling us. I didn't come to patch up the old covenant. I came to fulfill the Torah and inaugurate something completely new. That's the two pictures. I'm not here to patch it up. I'm here to bring something completely new and something that Judaism was never designed to contain, but to lead towards. Okay? It's a key thing. It's like Judaism was never meant to contain this. The old covenant was never meant to contain this, but certainly lead towards it. And that's the new covenant kingdom of God. Just two texts this morning. Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 6. Okay? Deuteronomy, Moses is laying out God's law for Israel. And this is included. These are the footnotes, the fine print that comes after all the blessings and cursings. Chapter 30, verse 6. Looking out to the future, it's already being telegraphed that the old covenant is not going to last forever, that there's going to need to be something new. Verse 6, and the Lord your God, looking to the future someday, what's he going to do? He's going to circumcise your heart and the heart of your offspring so that they will love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul so that you might live. And what's the call in Deuteronomy more than once? Circumcise your hearts. I'm not looking for you just to do outside physical things, but I need you to do a work of the heart. But the word of the covenant couldn't change the heart. And God says there's going to be a day where I'm going to do the work that needs to be done. We see it in Jeremiah 31, starting in verse 31. Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I'm going to make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, not like the covenant that I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. My covenant that they broke, though I was their husband, declares the Lord. So we have covenant they broke and the picture of adultery. That's what he's saying. They broke it. They committed adultery. They left me. I didn't leave them. They abandoned me. For this is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. Listen to this. Does it sound familiar? I'm going to put my law within them, and I'm going to write it on their hearts. I'm going to be their God. They will be my people. And no longer shall each one teach his neighbor and each other his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their iniquity, and I'm going to remember their sins no more. See, the new covenant is bringing so much new. And when God brings it, they're going to love and they're going to obey God just as God intended. To put it another way, people are going to follow the true spirit of the law rather than following an exhaustive list of religious traditions and arcane stipulations designed by humans, which is what we see on the Sabbath. Our two accounts. See, when we come to the Sabbath, what do we need to realize about the Sabbath, and what do they not understand about the Sabbath? Is that God didn't ordain the Sabbath as a burden to be endured. The Sabbath wasn't a burden to be endured. It was a blessing to be enjoyed in joyful praise and heartfelt worship and thankful rest. That's why God gave the Sabbath. To say, you're taking it off and you get rest and you're going to have to trust in me on this day, even though that grain is standing in the field, you're going to have to trust me that tomorrow it's going to be there. That's what you're going to have to do. You're going to have to trust me. I'm going to take care of you. But what did the Pharisees do over time? They had turned the Sabbath into an excruciating day of exhaustive rule keeping. Instead of a day to delight in God and to enjoy Him, it became a day of walking through another checklist. 39 specific laws to be observed. To make sure you didn't break the one command to not work and to keep the Sabbath holy. All sorts of extra stipulations added on to your life to make sure you didn't break the one. And we have two of them that are identified in our text. The first is healing. Well, actually, the second is healing. The first is harvesting. Two things. Two things that were off limits according to the laws of the Pharisees. They're not delineated by Moses. They're not given directly by God. These are those extra add-on barriers. See, when we have the disciples walking through the field, what are they doing? They're snapping off little heads of grain. They're kind of rubbing them in their hands, taking the kernels out, and kind of munching on them. Totally legal according to the law as far as walking through somebody else's field. They're not stealing. It's permissible. So they're just getting a little snack. Granola bar on the road. But see, what had happened is that over time, the Pharisees said, no, that's harvesting. That's work. Because you can't simply take it and eat it. You're actually doing a secondary process to get the grain out, and therefore we're going to call that work, and that's forbidden. And you can't do it. That's the heart of the first issue. And what they're saying is your disciples are sinning against God. It's no longer a matter of maintaining piety. They're directly sinning against the Sabbath. The healing. We have the man with the hand that's contorted. Very likely, he may have cerebral palsy. I don't know. But he's got a withered hand. And an oral tradition that was laid down by the Pharisees allowed medical attention for acute issues. It allowed it. If somebody's life was at stake, you could certainly give them medical attention. But this guy's had a withered hand for years. Yeah, that's George. George has had that for a long time. He's not dying from it. That's the problem is they're like, if you really love God and if you obey God, you're going to heal George on the next day, but not today. You'll heal him the day after the Sabbath because that honors God the most. What are they missing? What are the Pharisees missing in both instances? They're missing the true spirit of the law, what God is laying down. In the case of the disciples eating grain in the field, he tells them the story of David. And basically, it's that David's need for food demonstrates that human needs trump ceremonial commands. The Sabbath was given for man, for our needs. Ceremonial observance is always trumped by human need. In the case of the disabled man, that principle still applies, right? Human need trumps ceremonial commands. But there's something even more. There's something even more in this man with the withered hand, is that what's going on here is that Jesus wants them to see that seemingly religious people, seemingly good people, commit evil when they refuse to do what is good. Let it sink in. Sin is not simply an infraction of a prohibition. Sin is also refusing to do something that is good and you don't do it. There are sins of commission and sins of omission. And they're choosing wickedness. They're choosing evil. Because they don't want this man to be healed on the Sabbath. That's Jesus' point. Jesus wants them to understand it's right to heal on the Sabbath, whether it follows oral traditions or not. And I think on this point, just a minute on this point, it's important because I think that well-intending Christians set up boundaries in their life that give them permission to ignore good things that they ought to be doing. We give ourselves permission to commit evil by not doing the good things we ought. Sometimes by the barriers we set up in our life or the standards we think that we're upholding that are extra biblical. We use it to write off people that we ought be interacting with. And we make it okay. Two points of application connected with this one first. Is that we need to be careful that we're not building walls in our lives from the very people that need the gospel the most. We can't be building walls in our lives that keep us away from the people that need the gospel the most. See, Jesus calls us to be salt and light. And salt is something that if it's going to have an impact, it has to come in contact. Right? We all know that salt shaker, pulling that thing out and salting down our steak or whatever else we're going to salt. It's like we like that taste. It brings added taste to it. But if we don't shake it out, nothing happens. And historically speaking, salt brings two things. It brings added flavor and it brings preservation. Think beef jerky, think smoked salmon, okay? All those wonderfully delicious foods. Okay? That's what salt does. And God calls you and I to be in close contact with the world. Not being of the world, not being in love with the world, but to be in close contact with the world, because there's no other way that salt can have its effectiveness if it doesn't actually come in contact. The world needs a taste of gospel grace so they can begin to comprehend what the gospel means. Same way light. It illuminates. That's what light does, right? It just illuminates. It doesn't matter how dark the place you are. The smallest light lights it up. And the light is never consumed or inflicted or contaminated by the darkness. Light just gives light. That's where we're supposed to be in our culture. Bringing hope, bringing peace by dispelling darkness. The unbelievers in your life and in my life, they don't need our condemnation, no matter what their history and their failures are. I'm not saying we don't call sin sin. I'm saying we don't need to keep hammering the same gong. See, if we're given this picture of doctors working with the sick, we can't be the kind of doctors that open up a clinic and lock the doors just to give physicals to healthy people. These people need to see us. They need our friendship. They need to see what the gospel actually does to people, how it changes people. And I don't know how you grew up, but I kind of grew up that we went out of our way to not accept invitations from certain people to events to show that we were different. And there's some things that are best not to go to. But at the same time, there are many environments where we ought to be that we're not with the people that need Jesus the most. Number 2, we need to be careful that we're not setting up high bar standards for other Christians to meet, to demonstrate that they're holy and righteous enough as a Christian. We don't set external standards. We don't set lists that people have to prove themselves. What I'm not saying here is we're not talking about a credible profession of faith. One of the things we talked about last week in our membership class, that when somebody comes into membership, what are we doing? We're affirming a credible profession of faith. Not only words that clearly show us they understand the gospel, but there needs to be gospel fruit. There has to be those two coming together. We need those. But I'm talking about all those extra things like the Pharisees had on. Like standards of modesty, acceptable entertainment, educational options, alcohol use, political issues, just to name a few. Those are the kinds of things I'm talking about. And here's why. It's because external conformity, it has zero ability to change anybody's heart. Anybody can conform to the right behavioral standards if they know there's enough pressure and there's enough cost if they step out of line. They can do it, but never with the right reason. And that's not what we want. We want people to delight in Jesus Christ, to find their greatest satisfaction in Jesus Christ, to love God with all of our heart and soul and mind and strength. But far too many Christians fall to the lie that religious prescriptions give us power. Some sort of prescriptive life, some sort of checklist. And there's any number of them that you've probably bumped into over the years. But Colossians chapter 2, verses 20 through 23, Paul reminds us that they don't work. If with Christ you died to the elemental spirits of the world, why? Why, as if you were still alive in the world, do you submit to regulations? Don't handle and don't taste and don't touch, referring to the things that all perish as are used. These things are simply according to human precepts and teachings. These have indeed an appearance of wisdom in promoting self-made religion and asceticism and severity to the body. Let that sink in. Everything that the Pharisees did had an appearance of wisdom in promoting self-made religion and asceticism and severity to the body. We got to ask the questions, is that our pursuit today? Is that your pursuit today? Is it something that has an appearance? But they are of no value in stopping the indulgences of the flesh. They don't work. And he's saying, don't believe the lie. A lie which doesn't always come from the world, but a lie which often comes up inside the church as a reform movement within the church of people looking at something that's going on, wanting to see change, embracing something new, and then calcifying it as the new normal of what a life that honors God looks like. That's exactly what the Pharisees did. Not saying it begins with the wrong intention. Where does the trajectory go? See, two people can do exactly the same thing for totally different reasons. It's like you could walk into two people's houses that buy all the same furniture, all the same artwork, and everything. Exactly the same. Down to the utensils in the drawers. But you walk into each house and they smell different. They smell different. And when we think of this, as we think about living according to religious rules, one reeks of legalism and judgmentalism, and the other home has a sweet aroma of gospel-centered, Christ-exalting, Spirit-dependent grace. Both doing the same things on the outside, but driven from different motives on the inside. We need to be careful that we're not the kind of Christians who spend our time comparing ourselves to other people, but pursuing Jesus Christ. As Hebrews 10:24 says, let us consider how to build up one another to love and to good works. Good works are part of it. They're necessary. Let's motivate each other, not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. Let's close in a word of prayer.